As Brianne said, I feel fortunate to have learned and actually really been able to cut my teeth, so to speak, in some of the Main Street thinking and awareness with during my time on the board of the Port Townsend Main Street program with Mari, and through her leadership and guidance have really picked up and learned a lot that I've thus applied to many communities across the country. So for about the last 9 years, I've been working a lot around the US, primarily in small to mid-sized communities, focused on walkability, healthier places designed by for people, and humanizing many of the environmental things that we've done to our roads and to the full structure of our towns to bring them back to what many of our Main Street communities have, this timeless way of building communities that are supportive and inclusive to the needs of us as humans. So I look forward to kind of sharing some things today. We'll kind of talk a little bit big picture why we're here, and then we'll kind of distill down into some spotlight from a few of your fellow Main Street directors and kind of link it back together around some of this thinking on what is place activation and what is the purpose of public space, especially in light of our current situation, being in a global pandemic. So do we have the poll completed?
We have 31 people, so that's pretty good. Are you able to see the results, Samantha and Barb, or do you want me to say out loud?
I can't. So can you say them aloud?
Absolutely. With the first question of, is your Main Street located on a state highway? It came back almost exactly what we thought based on a quick survey John L did a few months ago for us. 17 do, and 15 reported that they are not on a state highway. So just about half and half. And the second question about what types of street activations they have participated in over the last year. Streeteries came back as the number one with over half. Sidewalk extensions had about 40%. Parklets were next with about a third. So about a quarter of the folks said other. And just a reminder, if you do want to include in the chat what other meant to you, please feel free to. And then after that, open streets, parking lot to Parker Plaza, and then pop-up bike lane just had one.
Cool. Well, that's fantastic. So I think some of this is hopefully going to continue to support and uplift efforts that have already been underway, as well as link to the fact that this can actually occur on different types of roads. It's not just local streets that some of these activation, reallocation of space can apply to. And I think, like many of you are probably finding, what we have seen in the last year is a real focus and attention to streets and to public spaces. They really have become a critical lifeblood of many communities, and a river that, you know, is still supporting us, connecting us, and helping us continue in these current times, which obviously has been a year of some solid reckoning on many fronts. So we'll get into that in a minute. But what I was thinking might be helpful as we frame today's conversation is the place, public space activation, public space being streets, being parks, being other like plaza type things, anything that is owned by the public realm, being the city. And so the question at hand is, how can we redesign or design public spaces for safety and physical distancing? So there's some kind of multi-layering, you know, what does safety mean? You know, what does physical distancing mean per our health guidelines? So just something to start to think about. And ultimately with the goal, right, of ensuring that our main streets continue to not only survive, but ideally find ways to thrive in this current state and as we move into what economic recovery due to the pandemic looks like. And so how can we avoid, empty storefronts, mass closures, and then also something that's really been on my mind as we all become more and more eager to leave the Zoom world is how can we fulfill our different social needs? And also in this time of reckoning, how can we recognize the deep systematic inequalities that we are actually faced with in our communities? And so a lot of what I'm going to share is actually nothing new per se. Um, Many communities and many places, like you shared in the poll, have been doing a number of things that I'll talk about for years. But I think where we have momentum now is that we have the ability to more quickly respond because we are in a time of needing to be very creative, needing to answer some of these questions on how we can support our restaurants and retailers, how we can support essential workers, things like that. And so there's been a lot more reactive flexibility emerging between different community partners and stakeholder groups throughout cities of the world. And so what we have started to find is that more people have become aware that there's not always enough space to get from point A to point B. So this is pre-pandemic world. This is still a world that many of us might encounter. And of course, through the pandemic lens, we quickly decided as communities in many places throughout the United States to close roads for cars and open them up for people walking and biking to give people more physical space to do physical activity, to get out of their homes, to get to work if they still needed to go to work. And then in this time of reckoning, of course, we were faced with the murder of George Floyd. And why I want to highlight this is because streets have the power and the capacity and the capability to really support and uplift all communities, or to further show some of the disparities that we have among our communities. And this is the George Floyd Memorial in Minneapolis. I grew up not too far from here. I have family that still live a few blocks from here. And now what is somewhat interesting is the city of Minneapolis is working with the different community groups on how does this intersection remain a memorial and what will that look like? And so how can streets support us in healing? And I think that is an important message as we look at the whole picture of where we are today in many ways as communities. And we, of course, experience the ripple effect. Streets are for democracy. They are places for us to gather. They are places for us to share our opinions and our ideas and to exchange knowledge. And streets serve really important functions to be able to move vehicles, move goods, move people from point A to point B in many different ways. Streets also set the welcome mat for the adjacent buildings and businesses that are on those locations. So this is Larimere Square in downtown Denver, the oldest part of Denver, the historic core of Denver. And many of you may recognize this image or maybe have even been there. But as we have been observing here within our own communities, but also communities elsewhere, I just wanted to use Larimere Square as an example of some of the paradigm shift that has occurred in less than 9 months. So this is Larimere pre-COVID. It's normal functions. It would occasionally close, for certain festivals and streets or festivals by closing it down to cars for a block. And so then the city and Laramie Partnership said, well, what if we do this full time during COVID? What if we close the street and open the street up to people eating, dining, socializing at a distance, and start to see how the street can better support the needs of us today and better support our businesses. And while this is a option and approach to do it, it really shows you this big leap that many communities have been making on how to re-envision streets as places for people. And of course, if you want to drop it in the chat, like, where in the world do you love to go and visit? That's not a beach vacation, but what city do you love to visit and why? Why do you love a neighboring town perhaps, or somewhere globally? What is your travel itch? Where would you go to enjoy a good glass of wine, and why do you love these places? And what we'll see, like with this Laramie example, is in this time frame, they're actually starting to model what a shared street can look like. And this is more reminiscent of many places throughout Europe, where the dynamic of users in a street space is not as heavily weighted to one use over the other all the time. Or in this example, the paradigm has shifted so much that people are first and the car is invited in. And so that's kind of like a very big picture of where streets can go and how they can start to support business and social life. But I want to give a example of a possibility out there, that project I worked on not too long ago. This is a Main Street community in New Mexico, Farmington, New Mexico. You'll see the 4-lane road. This is their Main Street. It looks a little chaotic. And working with the community and the Main Street organization, they came up with a vision to right size their street to make it more pedestrian friendly. And this is the street today. Construction was concluded last month. So you can see that it went from 4 lanes down to 2 lanes with a few different shaped modern roundabouts. Obviously, the landscaping still needs to be planted. But during this time of construction, plus moving construction through the pandemic and opening, they've actually seen 9 businesses open and locate on Main Street, largely because of that public-private like partnership, right? All of a sudden, the street was becoming more human scale, starting to become more attractive. And the city was showing investment in place. And it really has started to take on a whole new feel and life of its own. Excuse me. So here is one of the gateway features as you head into Farmington, New Mexico. And so this is a long-term scale project, but again, one of the first important steps, and I know this applies right to the Main Street 4-point approach, is what is the vision for the community? And where and how does the actual design of your public space, of your Main Street, fit in? What is the vision for that? And I know many of you have done a lot of work on your main streets over the years. And so you may have already kind of taken this type of step with your city. But the point is for the last 60 plus years, we in America have turned our cities into how are we going to accommodate the car? Where are we going to store the car? Where and how is the car framing our transportation and city making decisions. And what we continue to learn is that we actually can have a more resilient and a more supportive city Main Street if we focus the design of our communities around people. And so why does that matter? The economics of place are real. This is a photo from Issaquah. So obviously such a beautiful downtown with all of the landscaping, outdoor seating was already happening and is happening. But I want to give a little story just to help everyone understand how land use and transportation connect to support the economic strength of your city. So there's a economic think tank, Urban 3, that does this type of analysis all over the place, but they had worked with Durango, Colorado, which is just over 18,000 people. And they took 9 years of sales tax, property tax data, and looked at number of jobs per acre in the different buildings throughout the whole city of Durango. And what you'll see is this area where there's all this spiking occurring. What do you think that spiking is? Where do you think that is in the town?
Main Street.
Yes, Main Street, downtown Durango is outperforming everywhere else in the city. And you'll see on the map that we point out Walmart, and that's where the city allowed a lot of growth to occur. And that is their kind of commercial strip zone. And per square foot, they actually have more, this strip mall area actually has more retail space per square foot, but it's all big box. It's not mixed use. So it's actually not performing as well when you start to look at all the metrics of property tax, retail tax, jobs per the building, and so on and so forth. And so downtown Durango really packs a punch in that it is producing 10 times the amount of sales tax, property tax, and jobs per acre than the strip mall commercial form. So all of you have this to some extent, right? Your downtowns per acre are the most efficient way to generate your own local economy. And so what does that look like from the street level? This study just compared 2 local Durango shops, a bookstore and a coffee shop, versus the Walmart. And the coffee shop and bookstore saw 3.6 times the sales tax output than Walmart, and over 15 times the number of jobs were happening just in those 2 shops. And that's kind of from a per acre square lens, right? So they're taking up less space than the bigger box store. So I just want to paint the picture, I think, hopefully to affirm that, our attention on main streets and why main streets really support and are the center of local economies, to help reinforce why creating the place of Main Street from a public design perspective becomes really imperative in how you attract and retain people along the street.
Samantha,
So,
I'm going to interject with a
yeah,
quick question from Mari in the chat. Did Durango have open streets initiatives? Is that one of the factors here?
yeah, that's not even fully looking at the streets specifically. So it's just really looking at the land value alone. Durango certainly has done a number of initiatives like parklets, reconfiguring streets and intersections. But this is just to further illustrate like why focusing on the development of your downtown, of your main street actually pencils out a higher return than if your city is focusing on more strip, big box, kind of suburban like style uh, development in your town. So to reinforce that a human scale, um, this Durango is probably kind of this image is anything you could see on your main streets, most likely human scale, right? Lots of transparency in the windows, wider sidewalks, trees. Unfortunately, I didn't include a picture of a Walmart, but you could imagine, you know, it's kind of a desert for joy. You know, you wouldn't want to be walking through the parking lot to get to the building, right? There's no human scale relationship in that design. So why do we take a people first approach? We do it because we're actually in a time where we're demanding our streets do more than park cars and more than move cars and goods from point A to point B. And so one resource that is available to all of you is from NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And they came out with this resource called Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery and started to mock up examples of different ways we might need to utilize streets under different circumstances, right? So I'm sure many have had to work with businesses on how do you do pickup and queuing and maintain a 6-foot distance? What would it look like if we need to have more, you know, testing or vaccine places along our main street or within our downtown? And then certainly, you know, outdoor dining, different types of open streets or closed streets that allow for more walking and biking and dining in the middle of the street and cycle paths. So what I want to illuminate here in what we're thinking about in this kind of place activation series is that I basically the little bit of the backstory is I approached Brianne and I was like, you know, places that have already been doing some of these things have an advantage than places that haven't maybe done a parklet or haven't been thinking about how to reutilize public space to support businesses or to support healthcare workers or whatever the need might be. So knowing that we weren't coming out of the pandemic at the end of this year, the question I had to Brianne is, how can we work together with our Main Street communities to continue to uplift your efforts so that you can continue to work with your city and other community partners to seed some of these ideas to continue to build your own resiliency as you continue your journey and move into the years ahead with a little bit more of that the years ahead look a little less known, right? We don't know fully what's ahead of us. And so how can you start to take an incremental approach to making some of these bigger term or longer term changes, like in the example of Laramie Square, like in the quick example of Farmington, New Mexico? So these are just like 4 quick kind of reasons why you would maybe want to take an incremental approach. It allows you to develop new ways to work together. So work together meaning within your own Main Street organization, with your city, county, or state governmental partners, with other business partners or community partners. An incremental approach is relatively low risk because the cost to do some of this is relatively low. You get to discover fairly quickly what works and what doesn't work and how you can iterate from there. And thus you get to deliver public benefit or something for the public good faster, right? So kind of that 90 to 100-day approach that we'll hear from Catherine and Walla Walla, how they went about it in a minute. So that is incremental. And what does that start to look like? There's a need or there's an idea that you want to test measure, and refine. And then you can start to assess as a community what needs to change and iterate. This is really working well. How do we think about this in a longer term scale? Or, well, that was a flop because maybe we didn't have the right political support or the political will, or maybe we didn't do our due diligence and think through some of these steps that needed to happen to make it a success, right? So it's kind of taking a learner's mindset to the way we activate public spaces. So I like stories, and I will kind of start to wrap up with one last story. This is another community I worked with in Colorado, and we, Edgewater, Colorado, so another smaller town right outside of the Denver metro area. And we were working on a transportation traffic calming plan. And the community was like, we need to start to revitalize our main street. So this is their main street. And together they formed a vision to actually bring one block into a one-way. There's always a need for parking. So there was a question on how to get more parking if you were removing some from one side. And what this project actually seeded was a pilot project to start to test out some of the traffic calming tools to see how they worked in the community. And what this project also illuminates is that the town of Edgewater had the vision, they developed it together, they had strong leadership, and they had the vision to start incrementally, and they identified the need to test some of these things out. And in doing so, they actually got very lucky and had good luck in timing, because the pandemic hit and they actually mocked up and modeled their one-way conversion and made some changes. As you can see in this aerial view, put more outdoor dining options in and things like that. And they essentially did a second test and were like, yeah, we think this is what we want. So now they're actually going through the full design phase to start to say, how does this become a more permanent reality? And even in doing that test, they were able to determine that parking wasn't as important as they had thought it would be. And they actually wanted to include a bike path going the opposite direction of the motoring traffic so that it would give better access to the park that's right across the next street that you can't see here. And so I think what's important about incrementalization is that you can test things and vet things and build the community support in a way that really leverages future resources and future dollars, and just creates that buy-in. And so as we think about how are our main streets essential places and how do people get to our main streets, are there ways that people can arrive to your main street other than in their car? And what does that start to look like? And just to give you a perspective, like pop-up is kind of like just over a weekend, maybe a week event. So the materials are less permanent, more quick to assemble, a shorter term project. A kind of activation project, like the next one picture might be a pilot where it can be up for several months because the materials are more durable, and even maybe several years. This is downtown Seattle. They've had their very low cost separated bike path for a number of years now. And then maybe that moves into more of a permanent fixture. This is in Missoula, Montana. Many of you have been doing the parklets and streeteries, so I think you guys are all more experienced than I am in speaking to it. But what I wanted to highlight quickly here is that I think this small town of Louisville, Colorado, actually invented the parklet in 2009. I think they actually beat out San Francisco. So not all ideas come from the big cities. And what we have been starting to see, and I'm curious to learn if any of you have been finding similar results with your parklet or streeteries, is very positive reporting from businesses who take this on as a partnership. And to kind of clarify the lexicon, a parklet is like a mini park and a public space that's open to anyone at all times of the day to sit in. Whereas a streetery takes the same structure, usually is a deeper relationship with the adjacent restaurant and is a space that can be used to serve and eat people that are frequenting the restaurant versus just anyone in the public. So that's just a quick difference. So with that, I need to switch over to start to highlight my team. But parklets can also be pavement to parks plazas. Where do you have underutilized spaces like alleys, and how can those start to form important connections or new spaces to think about in your town? And I know Barb will hit on some more of the transportation thinking, but how do you make places easier for people to cross, to access? And what can you do to highlight different types of crossings, intersections, that celebrate place, that honor the character of who you are and start to further create that draw into your community? And so we're going to pass the mic here to several of your peers to talk about a few examples that have happened in Kent and in Walla Walla that I really think highlight, and even better than, than me talking, how some of this has come to fruition locally in Washington. And I just wanted to pair the Main Street approach transformation strategy with some of my thinking around the role of public spaces, and where you can start to see how the 4-point approach is a lot about how you steward place, how you manage place, so that you get these other outcomes and benefits, not only for the public good, but for the businesses and retailers on your main street. So with that, I'm going to ask Gayla from Kent to unmute and share a little bit about some of the things you guys have been working on.
So this image here was the start of our Inside Out, what we did during the summer, which was obviously trying to address the COVID restrictions and concerns and moving people into the street. So we worked very collaboratively with the city to close this block that has 5 restaurants on it, and I think about 12 businesses. And essentially did like a street closure that allowed outside dining, sidewalk sale, and had some vendors and artist types of booths there along the street, which really worked out really well. We did it for 10 weeks every Saturday, July through the end of September. And it was actually pretty small effort. We ended up getting some donations for the umbrellas, because a lot of these businesses hadn't done any kind of outside seating previously. So we started with just doing just opening the sidewalks, working with the city to waive permits and kind of fast track to allow them to do sidewalk seating. And then it moved into the closing the whole street once a Saturday, and then expanded it a little bit more. So it worked out really well. COVID or not, we will definitely continue doing this. And I don't know if we're going to have any more images for Kent in terms of our parklet or anything.
I do.
But we moved it into, as the winter months came, we partnered with the city again to use some of the CARES funding that we had to create some more permanent spaces. And I'm sorry, these pictures aren't all that great, because this just came in the fall, so our landscaping is still a little immature, but it's getting there. And we use lighting, wrapping the tree wraps. The lighting on this block isn't so bad, but on some of the other streets, we also initiated that. That's one of the big concerns that we have in our downtown, is that people said, it's dark, the infrastructure is old, and so pairing it with lighting, the landscaping, and the tents. So you can't really tell, but these parklets or platforms or whatever, they're built directly the same grade as the sidewalks, with a rail around it, a 42-inch rail around it, so it will address liquor control, as well as some other features. When these tents come down and businesses put their umbrella tables out, I think it'll look really much nicer.
Awesome. Thank you. And I am finally able to see the chat, so we'll start responding here to some of those. But in the meantime, the kind of taking some of the time frame approach that Kent applied for how to do the open street dining initiative, I think is a good segue into what Catherine from Walla Walla will share a little bit on some of their initiatives.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I love the 90-day time frame, both because it's how fast we built our First Avenue Plaza, and because, let's get this actually into slideshow. Well, we'll get to why it's cool. Does that look right in projections?
Looks great.
Yes.
Okay, so this is our First Avenue Plaza. Many of you saw this picture last summer when I shared it at our summer meeting, because I was so excited about it. And it was right around 90 days from conception to completion. The reasons I love this: one, I spent a lot of my early 20s and a lot of my early 20s money on Larimer Square in Denver. And so when a business owner came to me in February and we were talking about what to do with downtown and said, hey, it'd be cool if someday we did something like Larimer Square, I was all for that. And then a month later, when COVID hit and we started talking about what this would look like, that same idea came back up. So in collaboration with the city and with our local businesses and the ones along the street, we have fully shut down one little block of our First Avenue in what was kind of deemed as a pilot project, and now I think is very likely to become permanent. And so the reasons this is really cool is visually, it's fascinating. Economically, it's helped all the businesses around the edges. There's 2 coffee shops and 3 restaurants and some retail, and they've all been strong throughout the summer and even into the winter. So it's helped with a lot of those COVID things, but it also has brought people to our downtown that haven't come to downtown in a long time. So I think a lot about what Samantha was talking about with equity. I saw that more with this space than I have with other downtown spaces. Of course, my puppy barks right when I am talking. But so we have people who haven't come downtown in years who came down because they could use the space with their family. They could spend a little money on a pizza and be in a relatively quiet place, safe space, and be able to really appreciate the beauty downtown. So we always get asked how we did it. It was a lot of partnership with our cities through CARES Act funding and some help from Parks and Rec. You can see here, there's these wonderful little wine barrel planters. These were donated by our Wine Alliance because Walla Walla. And then you can only see a little bit at the end there. There's these really heavy cement planters at both ends that help create a more permanent thing to keep cars out, which of course safety was a concern. So if this had failed, we could have taken it apart in less than a week. We still could take it apart in less than a week. Lights would stay up, but everything else here is so temporary, but looks really permanent. And I think we're really good at that as Main Streets in terms of how we do it. The other pieces of it, though, that are so key, and I'll run quickly through the rest of my slides. This is sort of the end all be all of our efforts. We're really proud of it, but we also hit on a lot of the other small incremental steps that Samantha was referring to. So we have just sidewalk dining here, and you can see sort of 2 iterations. This little version with just tables, chairs, and 1 orange stripe didn't make Liquor Control Board happy. We had to ask for some forgiveness there and then add these types of things. I've had a lot of calls with our liquor control board guy to get it safe for our wineries in particular. We again partnered with the city and some of our businesses to choose tables and chairs that would look relatively uniform, which just adds to the whole streetscape of the full neighborhood. But again, doesn't take much effort or money to get this put in place. We also built out parklets. So this is one of them. It's a little bit more permanent in front of about a total of 11 of our downtown restaurants now. And this was a public-private partnership between the city and the business itself. So the city provided funds for materials. The business itself provided the construction labor. Really cool. The one thing I wish we had done different, well, two things I wish we'd done differently in a more full parklet thing. I think we should have had an application for people who were interested. It was more just word of mouth of who wanted one, and that ended up getting messy in some ways. We also, in the rush, didn't set any real design standards. The first 4 looked very uniform, and after that, they kind of went off the rails in ways where a few of them are just very accurate to the business they're for, but don't really jive with our whole downtown. So I wish we'd taken some time to develop some design standards around that. And then our final push was sort of a blend of the two. So this is where instead of our streeteries, which is our last picture, these are our parklets that we added downtown, where when our wineries are open, they're closed off for wine tasting. When our wineries are closed, these barriers come down and they're open seating for anyone who wants to be downtown. And for us in Walla Walla, we deal a little bit with a problem in our community where a lot think downtown is only for the rich wine tourists, as they say. So things like this that have created more public spaces have been incredible in terms of increasing our community's involvement in our downtown core. All of these were done in that 90-day time period or less. All of them leaned incredibly heavily on all of the things we're used to with downtown in terms of organization and promotion and things like that. I've had people who push back against the idea that we spent our CARES Act money on this instead of on, in particular, there's a few business owners who wish we'd spend it on destination marketing. And that picture I showed you of First Avenue Plaza has done more in terms of destination marketing than in terms of how frequently it gets shared and how frequently we get tagged on social from people taking pictures down there. And I wish I had pictures of how we decorated it for Christmas time, but I don't have those handy. But it's just another way that it's been really beneficial, and I cannot wait until we can fully program that space and have it be packed with people instead of spread out. So yes, Corby, you need to visit Walla Walla. I've been thinking, as all of you have talked today, I want to do a little Main Street tour during some of our quiet times because it's a heavy lift, but even just starting small is really, really cool.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. You guys are quite exemplary what you have done in Walla Walla. And we're going to turn it over to Barb. I know there's a lot of questions on some of the tactics in the chat, but we will hopefully be able to circle back on a number of those.
And actually, Samantha, you and I got an email, which I didn't expect you to see, from Barb. Her router decided to reboot for no reason. So we actually have a couple of minutes while we do wait for Barb to come back. Catherine, I don't know if you saw in the chat, but there are a few sort of technical questions. I wonder if you could do kind of like a broad explanation.
Oh, it looks like Barb might be back on. Barb, are you back? Oh, no. Okay.
Yes, I am.
Oh, cool.
Oh my gosh.
We'll have you jump in.
My Wi-Fi router decided to reboot. Why would it do that?
Because you're in the middle of a presentation. Well, Catherine, maybe we could follow up with you to gather some of the the technical questions that came in and provide those out later on. So
I'll screenshot them too and follow up with the people who asked individually. So
thank you, Catherine.
Get those answers.
Cool. All right, Barb. All you.
All right. Very sorry to miss the end of the Walla Walla discussion because I love Walla Walla and so many of your towns. When I'm looking at the list of the Main Street communities, I've been in almost all of them. And when I say I've been in them, I mean I have walked or biked on your main streets because that is what draws me to a town. And so very fun to say like, oh, Langley, we did a vacation in Langley. I go to Port Townsend. I've been to Ellensburg. I'm just going down the list saying, yep. quickly about my background with WashDOT, because I'm heading a relatively new division. We were created 4 years ago, March 1st, and I came out of an advocacy background, so I've done work somewhat similar to some of what you do. I headed Washington Bikes, which is the state advocacy organization, and with higher ed, communications, and public affairs. And going back in time, I have a really varied resume for working in transportation policy. I spent 2 terms as an Idaho state legislator, so I made public policy. And I worked for a little regional publishing company that did some of the official centennial publications for the state of Washington. So I've had, I would say, an affection for history as well as a connection to policy all along. WashDOT today is not your grandpa's WashDOT. Certainly from the top, we have leadership that really emphasizes the importance of place and a recognition that where state highways are and the kinds of roads they are have affected the places that have grown up around them. And in particular, with population growth in the state, we have what used to be highways through long stretches of, well, you know, pick your crop. It was wheat fields or peas and lentils or apple orchards or something. And now we have population growth. And so it's changed the character of what's happening around the highways, but we still have the same designs we had when those were, you know, meant to be wide, fast, and busy. And so that's something I would say we're grappling with for active transportation. I'm going to touch just quickly on this slide. I'm not going to talk about this slide, but I will upload a PDF, and all of these are clickable links to give you a sense of what we work on as the Active Transportation Division. When the agency created this division, we, as far as we can tell, became the first state Department of Transportation to say that walking and biking are in fact modes of transportation, and they should be recognized on the org chart the way that public transportation or aviation or rail would be. And so it means that I have a seat at the table and a voice in the room in a different way. And that's been significant as we try to develop some decision-making tools and information for us to use as an agency as we partner with your communities and with others. I want to point folks to our active transportation plan, taking advantage of this opportunity. We have a draft out for comment right now. It is a long document, I will say, and I don't know if COVID has disrupted your sleep patterns. Possibly this would help. It is over 180 pages long, but some of them are pretty technical chapters. And if you have time to look at it, the comment deadline gained. And this is part 1 of 2 parts, but it really focuses on state, how do they play a role in active transportation use? And given that about half of you have a state route as your main street, it's really on point for what does that mean that a state route that was a highway is also a main street? And we read those kinds of questions in the analysis we did of state right-of-way. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend as much discussion time on the next couple of slides, but point you to chapter 2 in the plan for a pretty thorough discussion. In particular, we really grounded our analysis around active transportation facilities in an equity framework because of the kinds of places we put wider, faster, busier roads, the kinds of neighborhoods that were sometimes divided by a highway being built, what that means for who does and doesn't have infrastructure, who does and doesn't have more exposure to pollution, those kinds of things. Those are all very real effects of transportation and land use decisions, and they show up in our crash data, which is my next slide. Often when I'm talking about active transportation, somebody in the room will say, well, not everybody rides a bike. They seem to pick on the bike piece and say, yeah, did you know that not everybody drives? It's actually a thing. And depending on which set of data you use for the denominator in the math, it's upwards of 20%, could be 25% of Washingtonians who do not hold a driver's license. What percentage it is kind of depends on, do you only try to talk about school age and above? And for our planning, we're thinking about, can your kid walk to school? But we have folks who have a medical condition or a disability or some reason they don't hold a driver's license and they still go places. So we take this equity framework very seriously in planning a system that really will work for everybody to get where they need to go. The second chapter of the plan also really lays out the safety data. And this is something your work really shapes as you make places. That's the kind of thing that cues a driver. They are arriving in a different location. This is not a rapid, fast, busy highway to speed through. This is a place to stop and potentially spend. And when we look at our safety data, we see a couple of factors in where we have out of proportion deaths. People biking or walking are killed in numbers that are well above what we would think of as our mode share, like how many of us, quote unquote, should die if everything were kind of evenly divided. More people die walking or biking. And there's two factors in particular, pedestrian crossings. And so I love seeing some of those pictures that were shared of creative markings and curb extensions, either with paint or with pavement, whatever you're doing, that can change what it feels like to cue the driver, because it's not just for the person crossing the street. The people driving deserve the information that tells them what to expect and what to do. They need to be able to see people to stop in time. So that mention of lighting in Kent, that's really important, pedestrian scale lighting in particular. Driver speed is the other factor here, that again, those streets that are were originally designed to be fast still feel fast. They still cue a driver to go fast. And over the last decade, 86% of fatalities of people walking or biking were on roads with a posted speed over 25. And that's really genuinely a function of the physics. But it means for us, as we look at the data, we say, what would we do if we're going to really take seriously our goal of reducing traffic fatalities to zero? We looked at locations of where crashes occur. The majority of them, those serious and fatal ones, are on city streets and some on county roads, but over a quarter are on state highways. And so we looked at, okay, which state highways? And this is specific to bicyclists and pedestrian statistics, not all drivers. And it's in population centers. And population centers are not just an incorporated city or town. These are also places that really feel and function like towns, but for whatever reason, they're not incorporated. And sometimes that's a function of interesting political history. Sometimes they just, they're happy with the county services, whatever it is. But you have places like Spanaway has a population of 27,000. So the census recognizes it as a place, but it's not incorporated. So in our planning and thinking about where is it that a state route is also going to function as a main street or a local street, it's in these population centers. So that's the kind of thing the plan speaks to, about identifying if we had money, and the plan doesn't provide money, it lays out why and where you would spend, it doesn't tell us how to pay for it, but where would we focus? We would focus our attention on population centers. And those are also the places with more destinations, more places to go. So the equity and safety data we really had in hand before the pandemic, and this leads me to our Safe, Healthy, and Active Streets program. We also had economic data about the benefits of investing in that kind of infrastructure. The Walk and Bike projects, when they did a study of the last stimulus package, the American Recovery and Revitalization Act, the bike and walk projects create more jobs per dollar than any other kind of transportation project. There's a lot more labor and less material used to create that kind of infrastructure. And the other good news about it is smaller projects mean smaller firms can bid and win. And so it opens up opportunity to become a contractor on a transportation project. A few years back, when I was at Washington Bikes, I co-chaired a Blue Ribbon task force that Governor Inslee appointed, looking at parks and outdoor recreation and the outdoor economy in particular. And as a result of that, his policy office now has a person who advises on outdoor recreation and economic development. And one of the things we found in an economic analysis was how big bicycling was in terms of what it puts into the local economy or the state economy. And it's mostly not buying bikes, which is good news because there's a waiting list at your local bike shop right now. It's mostly food and beverages and lodgings. It's the stuff you do while you're riding your bike. And you particularly like to do that in smaller towns. And it's startling for some folks to hear that outdoor recreation broadly supports more jobs in Washington than aerospace. And aerospace is only in some places. Outdoor recreation, really, we have a beautiful state, north to south, east to west. It's all across the state. For individuals, certainly the pocketbook economics question, active transportation is really low cost relative to operating a vehicle. A couple more points on this before I turn to the pandemic and our program there. The way, and some of this, obviously, I ran a bike advocacy organization, so I say bikes mean business. Biking and walking mean business to your downtowns, and you already know that. But for biking in particular, there's some infrastructure that may not be there. You might have sidewalks, but not bike lanes. And the studies that have been done where bike lanes have been added, there are higher sales tax receipts on those streets. And I always need to make the point that bike parking is actually parking, and you can get a lot more customers in the same space. These car outlines on the screen make the point. You can get about 10 customers in the space of typically 1 customer per car, maybe 2, fewer in COVID times. And for bike tourism, those folks, and I've done some bike touring actually through some of your towns specifically, you'd rather be in smaller towns. And if you're going to go on a bike trip, you will spend more on average per day than a car traveler. I can leave where I live now in Olympia, and if I were able to go visit my daughter in Spokane, I could drive the whole state. I could stop once at one of my agency's free rest areas and never spend a dime. And I certainly couldn't do that on my bike. So fueled by calories, stop and eat, stop and eat, stop and eat and sleep. And so bike tourism, I think, is one of those things we might think about in terms of recovery coming out of the pandemic. Tourism took a really big hit in this state, and it's not going to come back through massive conferences. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to go stand in a room with hundreds of other people I don't know anytime soon. But I would go on a long bike trip and feel comfortable. So just thinking about the long-term economic recovery and the short-term benefits to your local economies, that kind of infrastructure investment makes sense on a number of fronts. So that was all true, and then we got to the pandemic. And certainly those past decisions showed up on today's streets and roads in our crash data for 2020. It's not final yet, but I can tell you from the preliminary numbers that we had extreme speed events, and people took advantage of fewer drivers being on the road in front of them. Traffic congestion is actually sort of a safety measure. It provides a little friction. You don't go as fast if there's people in your way. And we had more deadly crashes in 2020 than in 2019. And that's preliminary data, that's not final, but it tells us those roads were designed for that. So how would we change that to get the outcomes we want, which would be to save lives? Early on, one of the things that happened as a very quick response was local agencies saying, well, we better close trailheads. Too many people are clustering at trailheads and we need social distancing. And so we worked with our partner agencies to say, you can close the trailheads, but the trail itself is actually a transportation corridor for essential workers. And again, those folks who can't drive might be using that to get to work if they're not getting on transit now. So we did that early, and then we started seeing what cities were doing and towns, like those pictures from Kent and Walla Walla. And in those places where the state route is your downtown, the question was, what could we do to be part of that recovery and part of safe social distancing? We also knew, because we started tracking the data, that people were walking and biking in larger numbers. So we have permanent counters in a number of places around the state. And if you looked at the data, 2019 compared to 2020, every other mode went down. Driving on highways, driving on toll roads, ferries, transit, commercial aviation, commuter rail, down, 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 down. Walking and biking up sometimes dramatically. And this is not just weekends and it's not just sunny days. The highest percentage increase in bike count was on November 1st. So probably not invited out by the sunny day on November 1st, at least not in a lot of the state. So this is part of our planning as well. And then more recently, I would say we've certainly started focusing more on thinking about resilience, both financial resilience. So we have folks whose personal pocketbooks were really hit by loss of jobs or they had their hours reduced. We already had issues around aging and disability, and we have the biggest generation ever of older adults who are going to age out of being able to drive safely. And I was looking at the screen trying to guess how many of you have gone through the discussion with your parents about not driving anymore. And you may not have had that yet. I cannot tell you how much you have to look forward to if you have parents who really rely on driving. That's a very difficult conversation. My kids aren't going to have that problem because I already know how to bike and use transit to get around. So this is another factor for us to think about as a society is, are you going to make the kind of place where I can grow old and age gracefully in place without a car that I'm not safe operating? And for physical health, we've certainly known for a long time that making places active and where it's easy to get healthy activity just kind of going out the door, that's better for us. More recently, we've had presentations from the Department of Health from a doctor who specializes in behavioral health issues. And I share this because this is a concern for us as residents of Washington and as taxpayers, that their prediction based on the kinds of responses they see to other disasters. So think a real tsunami or an earthquake, Hurricane Katrina, those kinds of things. When people are devastated, 40% of the population will develop a behavioral health issue. at a clinical level of concern. So that's substance abuse or depression or anxiety or something going on for you. 40% of the state population is 3 million people. So it's not a small problem. This is another health system surge that we're not set up for. And Dr. Mosseth, who did this presentation for us, talked about the ability to get outside as helping to flatten the behavioral health curve. So if you think of these healthy spaces you're creating, they're genuinely healthy as well as economically healthy and more important for us than ever. And of course, it's the cleanest forms of transportation that we can provide. So when we tried to think about how we could respond as an agency and be helpful to places that are really struggling, this idea that you might not have enough room on your main street for safe social distancing. Okay, this picture was chosen by Streets Blog. This does not illustrate anything we would ever approve as an agency, because we wouldn't let you sit with your butt right there about in the traffic lane. This is an impromptu parklet, possibly on parking day. But we did set up a process to make it easier to work with us to get to a yes, if we can do that safely and make sure people can still get to their destinations, to reallocate state route space temporarily. The community needs to come to us to ask for this. We need to have a speed limit that's 30 or less. If you had a speed limit today that's 35, and you said, hey, we want to actually lower it to 30 and then do this, we could take that kind of a request. Because of those design cues I mentioned and the safety issues, you're not going to drop from 55 to 30 and have any success at all. You can't just put up a sign, but you could start to step down the speed limit if that's something you've been considering that would tribute to districts. That is something you could test using this mechanism. I've got pictures of a couple of locations. One is Pullman, and Pullman actually was the first town to come to us to say, hey, we've been working on our downtown master plan, and we have this idea, already mocked up. We've already gone through public input on changing a 3-lane state route to a 2-lane, putting in back-end angle parking, first ever in the town, and doing a barrier protected bike lane. Could we test this? And this was part of the impetus for us saying, we're going to get more requests like this. Maybe not, we want to test our downtown master plan, but can we change our state route Main Street? Let's figure out how to process these so we give good answers across the state. And so we help communities. And so Pullman put this configuration in place. I don't have a picture of how it ended up. They got pretty quick feedback. This is the first ever back-end angle parking. I went to school in Pullman. There's a lot of people driving big trucks with, maybe a dually set up on the back or something. Like back-end angle parking was a new thing. And they got some pushback on that. So I can tell you, unfortunately, from my perspective, the bike lane isn't there now, but they got to test it. And so thinking about whether you already have a plan you'd like to test, that's one of the things, and Samantha mentioned pilots versus pop-ups. You could pilot a sort of a draft and move stuff around. You could do this with hay bales. You could do this pretty inexpensively. And then we have a place like Bingen. Bingen is in the Columbia River Gorge, population 712. And they asked if they could take 2 parking spots in front of, this is, I think, a tavern or a restaurant, and create some outdoor seating. So again, saying, how would we say yes? We could say yes. What the mayor of Bingen sent us an email to tell us. She went door to door, again, population 712, and you could probably do this as well, and personally talk to businesses before they put this in place. And only one was concerned about parking at all. So she went back around and talked to the restaurants and said, I need you to sign an agreement that you and your employees will not park on the street. So because these businesses are worried about it. Well, guess what? They actually ended up with more parking spaces than before they took 2 of them to make this. So sometimes the problem you have is not the actual problem. Your own employees eating up your space that could go to paying customers, apparently, in Bingen. So that's a couple of examples of what we've been able to say yes to as an agency. I've got a slide with a couple of other examples that are just local streets, but Samantha really already covered this. Bellevue did a really interesting thing, which was to look at places that didn't have as much access to green space and allocated streets so that they created outdoor activity spaces. Seattle, what was a buffered bike lane, got buffered by a parklet. So there's some different factors you can consider as you look at what to do. I was glad Samantha used an Ian Lockwood cartoon. I often use an Ian Lockwood cartoon because he's actually a transportation engineer, but this is a different one. As we think about our plan and our work as an agency, knowing that post-COVID is really pre-everything else, that we need to plan ahead for the kind of future we want. And that's what your work does. That's what I hope my work does as well, that we work from this equity foundation and framework and really end up with a more resilient and sustainable and livable kind of future. With that, I've got active transportation contacts for you. And again, I'll drop this PDF in the chat file. And I can stay on after the end of this session, by the way, to keep processing questions as you've got them. I know we're coming up on time pretty soon here. In each region office, we have somebody who may have other responsibilities, but they also have the role of active transportation coordinator. So if you have questions about projects or plans or how to do kind of that open streets request for a state route in your area, then these are your go-to folks to work with.